Right, we're going to get started then now. We are going to talk about briefing number 8, which is on markets and market failure, and then I'm going to go through the case study. But with me here in the NEF office is James Meadway, who wrote the briefing, and he's also going to talk to you guys in a later briefing about ownership as well. But for right now, just wanted to point out that all of the NGOs that have funded this project have all obviously benefited from the briefing so far, and this is just an alternative way for people that learn in a more visual or auditory way. And the 4 partners in the Marine Socioeconomics project have obviously come together to make this project work. The next series of briefings are critical because they're much wider issues in economics rather than just valuation and social return on investment and the kind of things you've been doing up till now. These are really important in terms of understanding the wider economic system as a whole. So without further ado, I'll hand over to James Meadway. He's going to take you through markets and market failure.
Yes, thank you, Chris. So the point of this briefing is, as it says, is to introduce what economists usually say about markets and how markets operate. Economics conventionally has quite a definite set of things that it says about how markets are formed, why they function, why they're considered to be a good way of organising society and the economy. And this is quite a definite set of related issues. So the first bit, I suppose, is to talk about, well, what is a market? And as it says here, the usual conventional theory in economics, the stuff you do if you went off and did an economics course, would be not just say that markets are a good way to run society and to organise people and things in society, but the best possible way to organise society and to organise how we relate to each other and how we produce and all the rest of it. And this claim is based on a series of underlying assumptions about how people behave, that they are assumed to be utility maximisers, that people are, that means that they're kind of, if you like, pleasure seeking, that you just are determined to avoid costs and you're determined to also maximise your utility to get the most available use out of whatever resources you have, and that if everybody behaves like this, then through a series of quite large theoretical claims about the world, you should find the market's the best way to organise society and the economy. So what is a market? A market in economics, really, if you get down to the, I think this is a sort of bare bones description of what a market is. It's a decentralised system of exchanging commodities that's regulated through the use of prices, and that, I think, is all the most important features of what a market looks like. So firstly, I'll come back to this, but firstly, it's about prices, that something is in a market. For a market to exist, something in that market must have a price. If you don't have a price, you don't really have a market. So whatever good or service, that's the commodity here, whatever good or service you have has to come attached with a price tag. And that price tag, if you think about it, tells you how much that good or service is worth relative to everything else. And that's what price is, really. So it's an expression of value in terms of other things. Usually we see these things expressed in terms of money, and money, of course, is what you use to exchange against any other commodity. What economics usually does is to try and strip out the use of money there, because it makes everything very complicated, and just say that if you have a price that is the expression of something relative, its value relative to something else, that will do for a price. So the most important price you've got, at least for this bit of economic theory, are relative prices, are the rates of exchange between different commodities. And the commodity, of course, is, in a somewhat circular fashion, is anything in the market that has a price attached to it. And that could be anything. That could be, you go to work, your labour is a commodity at that point. You go to a shop and buy whatever you buy, a newspaper, that's a commodity. It's something in the market that has a price attached to it. Part of it, of course, is that it is a decentralised exchange. Now, what that means, very particular here, is that the market can function without some external authority making it function, in the ideal setting. So you don't have to have something like government turning up and creating prices and making exchanges happen. That if we all just go out and see commodities with prices attached, we can make all our decisions ourselves. You know, I can just work out what kind of exchanges I want to do, you know, given my resources, given the income that I have. I can work these things out without any external authority turning up and telling me what prices should be or who I should trade with. So it's decentralized. This is really kind of fundamental thing about how economics and economists usually understand markets. So we can think of two groups of the market, two sorts of agents, I suppose would be the technical term here. An agent could be any individual or any firm or any household that is capable of taking economically relevant action. So we can think of two groups in the market. And really, for a market to exist, you have to have these two groups. You have those selling commodities, so people who turn up to a market and offer whatever commodity it is for sale. If you go to work, you're in the labour market, you're being paid for the commodity of your labour. And of course, on the other side, there's all those people buying commodities. Of course, these two things don't necessarily have to appear at any point in time. You can offer something for sale and then find there's no buyer. You know, this happens actually pretty much all the time. It's very rare that immediately you bring something to sale, you find someone straight away wanting to buy it. But for a market to be complete and closed and for transactions to take place, you need groups of people selling commodities and you need groups of people buying commodities. Now the important thing here, as it says in the slide, is that these two groups of people have different motivations. We can assume that those selling commodities, if you're not selling something because you want it yourself, if you wanted it yourself, you'd hold on to it. You're selling the thing to get basically profits. You're selling the thing to get money out of the act of selling it. You're selling it to get something else in practice. You're selling it usually to make a profit. You don't have to do that, but usually this is what's going on. On the other side, of course, if you're buying something, you're not buying it to make money because you're going to spend money to get there. You're buying it because you want the product. So the important thing here is the two motivations are actually completely opposite. But a market brings the two things together and makes everything function, and makes the exchanges happen, and makes the whole economy tick over in this kind of view of the world. So there's commodities that are offered for sale by people usually seeking to make as much profit as they can out of this. And then on the other side, there's people who want to buy those commodities, and as it says here, they can't just go off and buy anything they want. They have a budget. That budget is a constraint on what they do. So your budget might be how much money you earn in a week or a month, or it might be perhaps that you sold something yourself elsewhere and now have some money you can go and buy something in a different market. You sold your house and enough to buy, you just decide to live in a boat or whatever. You can do this. The point here is that you have a constraint on your freedom of action. You can't simply pick up anything you want. You have resources that you bring to it. So that's a setup on how the market works. Now, the important thing here, and the really big theoretical claim within economics, is that prices that everything comes attached to are set by the interaction of the people selling the commodities and the people buying the commodities. So the sellers who really want to get as much money as they can want to set as high a price as possible, and the buyers who have a resource constraint, have a budget constraint, they have limited resources, therefore want to get as low a price as they possibly can. Now, clearly these two things can't both appear all at the same time, so what you get in a market is a process by which those selling a commodity have to bring their price down, and those wanting to buy a commodity have to think about paying a little bit more. And of course, if the people selling the commodity for as much as possible are bringing the price that they offer it down, and the people who are buying the commodity for as little as possible, and nonetheless putting their kind of acceptable price up, they'll meet at some point. And that's the equilibrium point in theory. That's the point at which the market balances and is stable. It's stable because of the interaction of these two separate sets of ways that people behave in the market. The suppliers seek to maximize profit, therefore push prices up. The buyers want to get commodities that they find desirable. They want to maximize their utility in the kind of technical phrase here, and therefore they want to push the prices down. They can't both do this, so in order for trades to take place, they have to have a meeting in the middle. And that meeting in the middle is the equilibrium point, as it's known. It's the point at which the market clears, the price is fixed, and it's assumed to be stable. So, two fundamental features here. The first is that markets express relative prices. We've kind of touched on this already. That the price isn't some absolute thing that's fixed externally. It's a price relative to other commodities and other things that are available to buy or sell in the markets there. The point of the relative prices means markets are decentralised. You don't need an external intervention, and this is exactly, as it says there, this is precisely what Adam Smith meant by when he talked about the invisible hands that would bring together buyers and sellers in a decentralised way, not through the government, not through some other state agency or some external force, but the market itself would coordinate things, bring the two sides together, and then this process of some people offering to sell, some people wanting to buy, would, as if guided by an invisible hand, produce sets of desirable, socially desirable outcomes. And that was Adam Smith who coined this idea, as the first to really sort of theorise it. The second one is that if markets are competitive, they will also be efficient. Now, efficiency, that it says here, sometimes it gets a sort of bad name. You know, it's associated with undesirable attributes of life. If something becomes more efficient, it might just be, I'm not going to name names, maybe it's a large supermarket. You might think it's efficient, but it's not necessarily a very pleasant way to shop relative to just going to the local shop. Where, you know, it's efficient to do these things, it's just not necessarily very pleasant. I think usually economists would say that efficiency is desirable in relation to how markets operate, because it implies that given your resources, you're making the best possible use of them. You're not wasting things. So the claim really is that usually in conventional economics is that markets are very efficient. It's the most efficient way you can find to allocate resources in society, and this is a desirable thing because it means not wasting anything. Now they have a very particular definition of efficiency, which is described here. It's an economy with perfect competition, so get rid, we'll come back to this, but get rid of any imperfections in the market, get rid of anything that might change or get in the way of this operation of the market, this bringing together of buyers and sellers. The definition they use is Pareto efficiency, named after Vilfredo Pareto. He's an Italian social theorist back in the early part of the 20th century. Lots and lots of very unpleasant ideas about the world. If you go and look him up, I think for a while he did become an advisor to Mussolini and this sort of thing. Nonetheless, we're using his, or economics does use, his concept of efficiency, in which the market distributes goods and services in such a way that it would not be possible to make one person better off without making another person worse off. So just going through that again. Pareto efficiency is when it is not possible to make one person better off without making another person worse off. But if you think about it, that must mean that you're using all available resources as efficiently as possible, because if you could make someone better off without making anybody else worse off, you must have some unused resources out there. You have to have that. By definition, it's built into the thing. Note from this, however, that it says nothing about the equity of that distribution. It says nothing about how fair it is. The Pareto the distribution of goods in which everybody has exactly the same income and resources, and everything is used up that's available to be used up, that is efficient in this Pareto efficient sense. Equally, the distribution in which one person owns everything in the world and everybody else has nothing is also Pareto efficient, because you couldn't make anybody else better off without making this one person who owns everything worse off. So it says nothing at all about how fair the distribution is. It really says it's efficient relative to the amount of resources that are available. So that's how, in theory, in conventional theory, how a market should work. What you find pretty much immediately, and pretty much always, although various economists will dispute the extent to which this applies, is that this virtually never functions as the textbook expects it to. That markets in general, in the real world, are beset by various forms of failures, market failures. So, as it says there, which is more likely, if you go to a real world market, it won't appear like the textbook example of so-called perfect competition. It will be imperfect in some way, so there's something that's disrupting this. So market failure can occur, as it says, on either the buying side or the selling side of the market due to imperfect competition, due to people in the market just being a bit badly informed about what's going on, or you can also get this and this is particularly important for any kind of environmental economics, you can also get a species of market failure that occurs when operations in the market have unintended consequences elsewhere. You do something in the market and it produces an effect elsewhere. So I'm going to talk about these three things in turn. So, imperfect competition. And this can occur very simply usually when there are so few suppliers that rather than they have to go through this process of offering things for sale and adjusting their price relative to what the market wants, they have a degree of monopoly power, or they are a monopoly. You know, they aren't just a single firm selling a particular good. If you're a single firm selling a particular good, you can set whatever price you like, because anybody who wants that good can't really go anywhere else. There's no competition there. They have to go to you. You're the monopolist. You're the monopoly supplier of that particular good. You can usually think of a few examples. The Young British Rail was effectively a monopoly supplier of rail travel in this country. What you've got there, of course, is something like a case of natural monopoly, sometimes it's called, where it's actually very hard to try and run a competitive process of managing the railway, so that you can't run, two sets of trains run by two different companies on the same line at the same time. But in fact, railways form something like a natural monopoly, and as we've seen, the experience of privatisation since the 1990s is precisely this. It's very hard to get a kind of competitive market operating properly on the railway. So there's all sorts of fixes and regulations, all the rest of it you have to go through to even get to the point where it looks a bit like a competitive market. And of course, we all know the various stories about privatisation, and we all know how unpopular it's become since then. So railways form a kind of natural monopoly that, because it's so big, because it's such a huge requirement for infrastructure spending, because it's so hard to actually have competition existing there, it's a natural monopoly. Another example of imperfect competition mentioned here is oligopoly. You have a few very large suppliers who can either overtly collude with each other, they can form a cartel. So if you take OPEC, the oil producers cartel, very few oil producers, they can club together and try and fix the price of the oil that they're selling. Strictly that's illegal in this country if you try and do it. There's all sorts of competition law that says it's definitely not allowed. Nonetheless, and you do get cases and court cases trying to decide this, nonetheless large firms do have something of an incentive, because they want to whack prices up, to collude with their supposed rivals to try and make that happen. Now, I'm not suggesting here that this is what's happening in the case of electricity companies, but nonetheless, the electricity market in Britain, in which you have 6 suppliers, basically produce 99% of all the electricity we use. Very clearly, it's an oligopolistic market. It's not perfect competition. There are, in particular, very high barriers to entry. It's very hard for you or I to just go off and set up a new electricity company. So these 6 firms tend to act in a certain way and act in ways that isn't quite the same and can actually be very distinct from what we might expect in the ideal setting of perfect competition. So that's oligopoly. More unusual case at the bottom is monopoly, where you have a single buyer of a product, and that's when a single buyer can force the price down of a particular product because they have the power in the market. They're the one who all the suppliers have to try and sell their products to. Which is much more unusual in that case, so it does sometimes occur. Imperfect information is, as it says, the case where the information, what people know about the market and about the goods and commodities for sale in the market, and what we know about other participants in the market, they're not necessarily well informed about all this. And if they're not well informed, the decisions they make in that market will reflect their failure to be well informed. You get the market failure because instead of people turning up knowing, for instance, the quality involved in a good being offered for sale, they don't know this, and that changes how they behave. This is a classic example, as George egg floss, classic paper, the market for lemons being the American slang for a rubbish used car. That if you want to buy a used car, you don't really know how good that car is, you don't know how trustworthy the person selling it is, so you're wary about buying the car, and you'll behave differently, you'll offer different prices, you won't act in the same way, because you don't know how good the quality of the car actually is there. And this information asymmetry, this kind of unevenness in information. The person selling the car knows exactly how good or bad the thing is, but they're not going to necessarily tell you that. You can get different forms of this, and the two, slightly a jargon down there, but the two are highlighted is one that gets called moral hazard, which has been referred to a lot in relation to financial markets and things, where you can't necessarily, particularly because in the labour market, when you pay someone to do a job, you can't really monitor what they're doing. You don't know how well or how hard they're going to work. You just pay them to perform a task. They go off and do the task. Did they work hard? Did they apply lots of effort? You don't know. Right? So it's kind of moral hazard. You pay them and they go off and do what they want. You can't monitor them properly. So moral hazard occurs. That's the information asymmetry. Adverse selection, as the name suggests, somewhat similar, which is that you just don't know. You don't know how good or how bad anything in the market really is. So cars is an obvious one. You can also maybe find it in the labour market. You get people applying for a job. You don't actually know how good or how bad they really are at being able to do that job. So you get a kind of adverse selection problem that occurs. Both of these things disrupt what a market does. Final one is externalities, and this is critical, I think, for the environment. And it's the most important one if you're dealing with any kind of environmental issue at all. As it says there, this is externalities are the consequences of market activities that are not properly priced by the market. So that's a bit of a condensed explanation, but it's basically that if you go off and take part in one market, if you go and perform some actions and people are buying and selling and all the rest of it, that's just the market there, and the price that you get in that market will only reflect the actions that the market is aware of, if you like. So pollution is a very, very good example of this. A firm is producing goods, it sells those goods, it gets a profit from selling those goods, but at the same time it produces pollution as part of its process. So it's dumping toxic waste in the river, or it's belching out sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, whatever. These are things that the firms do, and that it happens all the time. Now, the issue you've got there is that the firm is just concerned about the price it's getting for its goods. As far as it's concerned, what happens to the environment is totally irrelevant. It really doesn't feature in its calculations. But it's for the rest of us, this is a negative externality that the firm is generating. The true cost of what the firm is doing is not just the private cost of how much it costs the firm to produce the good, it also includes the cost to the rest of us of the pollution. So there's a private cost, which is what the firm is spending to produce the goods it's making, and then there's the social cost, which is the additional cost of all the pollution that's being generated. If these two things differ, then you've got an externality, in this case a negative externality. We can work the other way around, of course, and have a positive externality. If your neighbour decides to really look after their garden, if they trim hedges neatly, they plant lots of flowers, all that sort of thing, your neighbour is getting some benefit out of this. It's their garden. But everybody else in the street also gets some benefit out of this, because it's better to have a well-maintained garden on the street than one that isn't. So there's a positive externality there. So there's a kind of positive version of an externality that can also occur. As I said, negative externalities in particular, absolutely central to understanding problems in environmental economics, and also understanding why there might be a case, despite what the conventional textbook version of how a market works says, why there might be a case for intervention, usually by government. And that is exactly when you have market failure. Pollution being the most obvious one. If pollution is occurring, the way that we normally deal with this, or the way we have dealt with this, is to write a law that says we will regulate in some way the production of pollution. So we might ban whatever it is that's being used that causes it. We might seek to tax the use of whatever is causing the pollution here. You get more complicated things. Europe has a carbon trading scheme that you try and create a kind of market for carbon, and then you want to trade within that market to try and get efficient solutions to the problem of greenhouse gas production. Very famous paper by Robert Coase from way back in the 1930s that attempted to demonstrate that this would be the most effective way to deal with problems like pollution. But in any case, there's a case for intervention there, because you're not in the world of perfect competition. There is market failure. If you have market failure, you can construct a good case for intervention. Good in the sense that a bunch of economists that kind of understand it and agree with you. Maybe others some reasons why you want to intervene. You might be concerned about the fairness of the distribution that your economy is producing, so you introduce tax to redistribute wealth. You might have some moral qualms about some activities, so you ban some drugs, for instance. There's lots of other reasons why you intervene, but this gives you a kind of economic case for intervention. If you have market failure, and in the case of the environment, it will nearly always be some sort of externality, usually negative externality, then you can construct a case for intervention on the other side. So most environmental issues have the character of being market failures. Overfishing, overgrazing, an absolute classic example of this, tends to get known as the tragedy of the commons, that you have a big common resource that everybody can take part in, it's pasture or it's the sea, and everybody's got an incentive to go off and get as much fish or graze as many sheep or whatever as they can, because they get the private benefit from it. They get the fish. They make money out of doing this, or they get to eat loads of fish. And depending on how developed your economy is, I suppose. You get that private benefit, but the fact that you need to, there's kind of biological thing going on here. You have to have enough fish still left in the seas and carry reproducing themselves, so the stocks don't collapse. You don't care about that impact if you're just going for your private benefit fishing. Therefore, you get, and everyone does this, you get overfishing. So that's the tragedy of the commons. There's a problem there in that you have this big common space, anyone can go into it, off they go, they don't care about the negative externalities of what they're doing, and the net result is, in this case, overfishing. So you can get all sorts of solutions to it. You get quotas, nationalisation, regulation of consumer markets, lots and lots of different things the government might be able to do at that point. Okay, that's it from me as far as the theoretical introduction goes. I'm going to hand over to Chris now for the case study.
Brilliant. If you guys have any questions, of course, just use the chat box in the bottom left. I hope James will stay with us for a few more minutes. I know he's busy, but as I start going through this, if you do have any questions that link to that, it would be good. One thing that stands out immediately is when James spoke before about cartels and oligopolies. If we think about how the right to fish is controlled in the UK, it's obviously done through producer organisations, which is also a form of cartel. So that's something that's very important to bear in mind when you deal with all kinds of issues surrounding fisheries. And James will come back in 2 weeks' time and talk about ownership and property rights, which also follows quite neatly from this area of work. Now, the case study is really about one particular kind of market failure. It relates to overfishing, but the particular idea is that for the government to step in and correct for that market failure, that they would use a subsidy in fishing. So they would pay people to try and cancel out that market failure. There's lots of different forms of subsidies in fishing. There's direct ones, as in payments to vessel owners, and there's indirect ones through not having to pay the full tax rate on diesel, for example, for the boat. But these are all different ways that the government has stepped in to try and correct for a problem that's been caused by an unregulated market. Unfortunately, the way subsidies are allocated often makes the situation worse. There's a big vote in 2 days' time for the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund, which hopefully all of the organisations are busily trying to raise awareness about and influence. In terms of context, in Europe we've got 2 to 3 times more boats than are actually needed for fishing at sustainable levels, which means that the fleet is economically unviable because there's too many boats basically for too few fish. The subsidies are then paid to compensate for these losses, but all you're really doing is masking the fact that these businesses are actually totally unviable as well. It's reached a point in European fishing where most of these fishing companies really wouldn't be able to survive without these subsidies, which in itself was actually making the problem worse and keeping it going rather than wiping it out. The question as to who gets them and why is a very, very wide one. You can read about it in detail in the case study, but they generally go to the owners of fishing vessels. They often also go to public bodies that represent fishing industries or different businesses within the industry. Can also be recipients of subsidies. Lots of the ones in Europe were actually paid for scrapping vessels, and the idea was the market's failing, there's too many boats, they're too powerful, there's not enough fish, we're going to pay you to scrap your boat. But because these subsidies were so badly designed, what people did is they thought, brilliant, I've got a really, substandard, very old boat, I'll scrap that. I'll say it costs, 10 million euros. I'll get 10 million euros and I'll buy a bigger, more powerful boat. So actually, it developed a sort of perverse incentive whereby they were trying to remove big, powerful boats from the fishery, but all they ended up doing is actually upgrading them at vast expense to the taxpayer. There's a fantastic website called fishsubsidy.org, which I would invite you all to look at, which lists by port and by vessel the amount of subsidies received for some of these fishing vessels, and it really is absolutely mind-blowing the amount of public money that has gone to often private businesses. That fits into the modernisation and scrapping of vessels, but also, as I mentioned before, not paying a full rate on your diesel is obviously now written into the business model. It's the same for the aviation industry. So the reason EasyJet can charge such low prices in part is because they don't pay £1.50 per litre of fuel, or £1.38, whatever it is now. They would pay something to about 35p a litre. Obviously, if you're out running a trawler and you're only paying 35p a litre instead of £1.35, you can see what a massive difference it makes. But if the externality is overfishing, something that we all suffer the consequences of, why should the taxpayer be paying for that to happen? At EU level, the Common Fisheries Policy pays out more than €1 billion per year, and obviously the majority of that up to date has gone to Spain, which receives almost half of the subsidies. What that means for consumers in Europe is that when Europeans actually go and buy a fish, you're really paying for it repeatedly. You're paying a market price, which is your £2.50 for a cod fillet or whatever. You're also paying again through the loss of future fish, because we're overfishing, there's not as much fish as there could be, and you're also paying a subsidy to enable that overfishing to happen. So your tax money is actually going towards doing something that's actually damaging in your interest and also in wider society's interest, and of course, as we all know, to the detriment of the environment. They're currently managed through Europe under what's known as the European Fisheries Fund, which is the EFF, which is now going to be replaced by the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund. And there's a vote in 2 days' time about how this main subsidy arm is going to work, and it will determine how much money is going to be paid and to whom and what that can be spent on. So this is really major, and it's something that hopefully you guys will be mobilising your members and promoting, because when the European Parliament votes on this in 2 days' time, they really need to be spending the money, European taxpayers' money needs to be spent on data collection and on control and enforcement. And those are things that lead to sustainable fisheries, those are things that will lead to a better common fisheries policy, and those are the things that will make that kind of situation a reality. So not voting for the construction of more vessels or to upgrade their engine size, that's obviously just going to add to overfishing. So there's a website that lots of organisations involved in Ocean 2012 have been involved with, which is this votefish.org, and that's where we're trying to convince MEPs that they should be spending European taxpayers' money on data collection, control and enforcement, not on new vessels. It's this votefish page, which you might have seen. Obviously you can spread the word through this page, but it also has a list at the bottom of all of the MEPs. So if you could spend 2 minutes just to write to your MEP, this is really the kind of the nitty-gritty of what the Common Fisheries Policy will do, because this is how subsidies get spent. If they get spent on new fishing boats, and we already have massive overcapacity, we're going to be in a lot worse situation than we were up until now, regardless of what the actual Common Fisheries Policy said. So that's it from me. If there's any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box, or you can email them to me afterwards. Next week at 5 o'clock, we'll be talking about money and finance, and the week after that, James will be back to talk about ownership and property rights. Are there any questions?